Walsh. This series is called Care of the Self. Previously, we talked about 3 different sources of chronic emotional states and sources of other chronic states as well. One was belief, a belief that we carry from any time in our lives that really requires that emotional state or something else. Then a second source was some event or series of events from the past that hadn't been fully resolved and was triggered by events in the present. And a third source was genetic. Call it a force when we're hardwired for that chronic state. Well, there's a fourth source of chronic conditions, especially chronic emotional conditions, but it may be other kinds of chronic states as well. And this fourth state has to do with isolated parts. We all have many, many parts within us, or ego states as they're called in psychological terms. And these isolated parts, well, can cause problems. So we're going to talk about that. First, I want to talk a little bit about how we learned originally about parts. And it was a disciple of Sigmund Freud's, a fellow named Paul Federn, who continued using hypnosis after Freud poo-pooed it. And Federn realized that he could make contact with and communicate with some aspect of a person that was involved in a problem state. And he could negotiate resolution of that state, talking directly to this aspect of a person. Now, because he was Freudian, he believed that this aspect he was communicating with was a fractionated part of the ego. So he called it an ego state, and that's where the term first originated. And Federn was not a great writer, but he did publish some things depicting what he had discovered. And others followed up, and eventually John Watkins picked up on it and really explored this dimension of human experience and human presence greatly, and published articles and books on ego state therapy and theory. This is kind of the history of our awareness of ego states, even though back in the 1800s there were discoveries made about, well, various personalities within the same individual, which could have been called ego states. So now let me explain how these parts get isolated. Before I do that, I'll just say that the first parts or ego states are developed intrauterine, as has been explained to me by parts. And these are blood parts. Once we're born, then other systems develop their parts. And parts basically are created to oversee the functioning of certain systems. So there are liver parts, and there are lung parts, and there are kidney parts, and bone parts, and on and on. And these different parts oversee the functioning of whatever system they were born to. The parts, as explained by parts, are born of cell nuclei within that particular system. And so that's their primary function. Now, parts get involved in many, many other functions as well. And when any of us has a big emotional experience, a not so good emotional experience, our system creates parts, new parts, and then attempts to give that experience with all of its emotion to these parts. And then the parts are put in isolation to protect the system from destabilizing. So this happens commonly. It doesn't have to be a trauma experience to cause us to create new parts. It might be a kindergarten teacher looking at us the wrong way and we just freak out and boom, these new parts get made. So, but the same process is exactly what happens with trauma. And this is why many trauma survivors are partially or even fully amnesic for their experience, because the parts carrying the experience get put in isolation. So these parts can be a source of chronic conditions, chronic emotional conditions. So the first step in, of course, doing this work is to develop that signaling system with the unconscious, as we've outlined in a previous section. You'll want to work with your fingers so that one finger lifts up as a yes response from the unconscious, a different finger lifts up as a no response from the unconscious. Once you've developed that signaling system, then you can question the unconscious and get direct answers. So let's say that you've questioned the unconscious about the source of a chronic emotional state like anxiety. So the source of the state is not a belief. The source of the chronic anxiety is not an event or series of events from the past. The source of the chronic anxiety is not a genetic propensity or a force. And so then you can ask, is this source of chronic anxiety being carried by a group of parts? Patiently await a response from your unconscious. If you get a yes, then you can assume that these are isolated parts carrying this source. These parts are either triggering some other source, one of those three other sources, or they're just generating the anxiety as a result of the experience that they're carrying. They're activating that experience in the present. And so there is chronic anxiety or chronic depression or some other chronic condition. Okay, so we've found out that these isolated parts are at the source, and then we can take a rather direct approach and we can ask the unconscious, will all that these parts carry now be released and resolved in whatever way is truly best for you at this time, or I should say for me at this time? And if I get a yes, then I ask the yes finger to lift up when these parts are really free of everything they're carrying. When I get that signal, then I will ask, is there a place in the past to put the thoughts and perceptions and sensory experience that are no longer appropriate in the present? And if I get a yes, then I suggest that can happen, and the yes finger can lift up when that process is complete. If I get a no, then I will say, is all of that information important for the rest of the system to understand? And I'll likely get a yes. Then I'll say, these parts are currently being processed out of isolation. so that they can join the rest of the system, which means that they will be communicating with the rest of the system, and they will be able to share their experience with the rest of the system. So what they're carrying will be known once they're out of isolation. So will it be all right for the thoughts and perceptions and sensory experience that's no longer appropriate in the present to find a place to rest in the past? And that typically yields a yes response, and so you can ask the yes finger to lift up when that process is complete. Now, you may not be able to get this process complete. The unconscious may indicate that that information is going to be preserved in the present. That's okay. Once that process is complete, or if the process cannot be done, you can ask the unconscious, will these parts now be released from isolation, join the rest of the system? Typically the yes finger lifts up. And so these parts can, well, join the system and discover current reality. And I typically ask the yes finger to lift up when these parts are no longer isolated. Once that happens, that source of that chronic emotional state or chronic condition, that state is resolved. So this is how that process works. Now, let's say that there's some other chronic condition. I'll give you an example. There was a medical professional I worked with that developed chronic shoulder pain. And it was so severe that it really impeded the functioning of one of her arms. And it caused her to really limit what work she could do. And she came to me a week before she was going to have exploratory surgery on the shoulder. Now, she told me that 10 years previously, she had been in a car accident and injured her shoulder, but everything healed up and there was no aftermath to that problem. But this chronic pain developed last year, and it's just gotten worse and worse, and it's become debilitating. Now, she also told me that she had just gone through a very, very difficult divorce. It was a messy divorce, and that divorce concluded a year ago. So she developed the finger signals, and I questioned the unconscious. I asked if there were any parts that had special information about this pain in the shoulder. Yes. And are those parts willing to communicate with me? Yes. Okay. And are those parts contributing to the pain in the shoulder? No. Are other parts contributing to the pain in the shoulder? Yes. I said I would like to talk to the parts that are contributing to the pain in the shoulder. Are these parts willing to communicate with me? Yes. And so it turns out that those parts were carrying the great distress of her divorce. And so we went through the same procedure I just described. These parts released and resolved all that they were carrying, repositioned thoughts, perceptions, and sensory experience that were no longer appropriate in the present to the past. And then these parts resolved the distress they were contributing to, the pain. And then the parts left isolation and joined the rest of the system. And that resolved the pain. There was no need for surgery with this particular person. So that's one example of a chronic condition other than emotion that isolated parts are involved in. Okay, now once parts are out of isolation, typically they celebrate. It's quite a joy to be, well, to get out of jail essentially, because they've been stuck with this not so nice experience, all that emotion for however long it is. And it's quite a joy to get out of isolation and be able to communicate with other parts and no longer alone. But parts typically want something to do. They want some purpose, some function. And this is where a new job can come in, or perhaps an existing job that needs more help. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in the next segment. Realize that all of this information can be found in the Care of the Self Owner's Manual book, easily available to you. Okay, thank you for watching, and hopefully see you in the next segment. Goodbye.